and good morning to everybody. Hope you had a good day yesterday for the rest of the day and enjoyed the case studies that we did on the broilers. But today I'm going to start off our technical talks with an important subject, as Taryn mentioned, and that's going to be cold weather ventilation. I do apologize again for yesterday for some technical issues I had. If they do occur during this session, I just ask you to please bear with me. It'll be a sort of couple of seconds, but I hopefully will be able to jump back on and be able to continue with the presentation without too much delay. Okay, so getting into the presentation. So basically the outline of what I'm going to be talking to you about today is minimum ventilation and sort of why we need to ventilate, what minimum ventilation is, what do the birds need and why in terms of their oxygen, carbon dioxide, moisture control, and then how do we properly ventilate. So looking at the correct airflow through the houses, talking a little bit about pressure in your house, and then a little bit about inlets. And then finally, the last sort of topic is going to be talking about some circulation fans. Okay, so when we talk about ventilation, we sort of mentioned that there's three main stages of ventilation, and those are minimum ventilation, transitional ventilation, and then finally tunnel ventilation. So when we have cold weather, we talk about minimum ventilation. So that's what we're going to concentrate on in today's session. The other two will be covered by my colleague Andrew Bourne later on this afternoon. So what is minimum ventilation? So minimum ventilation operates if your house temperature is at or below the set point temperature that you've set into your controller for that bird age. It runs on a cycle time, and generally what we recommend is to run a cycle time of around about 5 minutes. And we have a minimum run time within that cycle time of around about 60 seconds. And that's just to get some correct air and heat distribution around your house. And we'll look into a lot more detail into that a bit later on. The minimum ventilation is responsible for air quality. It's responsible for the removal of moisture from your houses and keeping your litter dry. You want to make sure that you provide the required oxygen to those birds at all stages. And you're going to usually use your sort of smaller fans, not your tunnel fans. Maybe you have some smaller fixed volume fans that you'll use for minimum ventilation. And we want to make sure that we can do all of this, but still keep low air speeds. Often you'll use minimum ventilation when there's chicks during brooding, and you want to make sure that there's no drafts and that you're not chilling them. You're not trying to cool the birds down. You're just trying to get good air quality and remove moisture from your house. So what do the birds require 24/7? So you want an oxygen content in the house of more than 19.6% at all stages, and a carbon dioxide content of less than 3,000 parts per million. We spoke a lot about that yesterday for brooding, how important that is. It's very difficult to measure the oxygen content in your houses, or it's expensive if you want to get an oxygen meter or anything like that, and it's not as accurate. However, it's very easy to measure carbon dioxide levels. So if you've got low carbon dioxide levels, then it is sort of likely that you'll have good oxygen content in that house. Carbon monoxide, we want to be less than 10 parts per million. Ammonia, less than 10 parts per million. And we don't want it to be too dry and too dusty in those houses. So what happens if you get it wrong? Well, unfortunately, you can have real disastrous consequences in terms of very high bird mortality, get ammonia burns and dust into the eyes if it's too dusty, ascites or water belly, lots of wet litter, pododermatitis, breast blisters, hock burns, all the bad welfare things for these birds. It's not going to make your birds happy, and you're going to lose performance and potentially lose a lot of birds. So we don't want to get it wrong. So looking at oxygen, so oxygen is required in metabolism. When those birds are growing, they need it to be able to grow. And if you have lower temperatures, the birds require more oxygen to be able to survive because they need to get high metabolism to use that energy of the feed to keep themselves warm, and they require more oxygen. However, when we look at these chicks, these small vulnerable chicks in the first week, their respiratory systems are at or near full capacity already when they're at comfort temperatures. So if you've got bad temperature management, they need more oxygen, it's really going to hamper their respiratory system. It's going to put pressure on the heart, and that can lead to ascites. So just a 5% increase in demand for oxygen can lead to a lot of ascites, and we don't want that. So you don't want to restrict the birds in temperature, but restricting them in temperature and ventilation is going to be very bad. And I showed you this slide yesterday during my brooding presentation, just some very good research that was done by Justina Caldes. And basically, we've got bigger birds today compared to before, and we need to provide them with more oxygen. More birds require more oxygen, or bigger birds require more oxygen compared to smaller birds, and they produce a lot more energy, so they require more ventilation to keep them cooler. Okay, moving on to carbon dioxide. This is the first waste product that your ventilation system needs to manage. So you can potentially get carbon dioxide from your heating systems, you're going to get carbon dioxide from your birds, they add that to the house, and the sort of level of carbon dioxide outside is around about 400 parts per million, but we want to make sure that we can keep it inside below 3,000 parts per million in that first week. And that's what determines your minimum ventilation rates in those first few days, keeping that carbon dioxide level low. With good temperature control, but insufficient ventilation, these carbon dioxide levels can quickly exceed 10,000 parts per million. Here we can see a picture on the side where we've got carbon dioxide levels of 6,284. And what you're going to see is a lot of lethargic birds at the sides of your houses, because there's some air leaking in through the inlets, and they're going to sacrifice eating and drinking to be able to get that fresh air and get that oxygen. Some additional signs, as I mentioned, grouping near that side because of those leaking inlets. So temperature and air quality, we want it to be uniformly distributed around your house, and the way that we make sure that there's good air quality uniformity and good temperature uniformity is by having even inlet distribution around the house. And I'm fully aware that this is a bit of an issue with a lot of the farms that you have at RCL, where you don't have evenly spread inlets down the length of the house. So it can be a little bit difficult to get that good uniform air quality and heat distribution. So the quality for the bird, or the air quality for the bird, is determined by how far away it is from an inlet. Air quality is determined by how many inlets you have and how well they're distributed. Okay, so that carbon dioxide is most likely only going to be your sort of issue in the first week in terms of determining how much you need to ventilate for minimum ventilation. Thereafter, we can see that minimum ventilation is going to be determined by moisture removal. So the red line and the green line, that's carbon dioxide, and it's a little bit higher than the blue line in the first few days. But after the first week, you can see how much more moisture removal becomes the driving force to making sure that you've got good minimum ventilation. Okay, so we want to maintain good litter conditions throughout the cycle. How do we maintain good litter conditions? By removing moisture from the litter, of course. But how do we remove this moisture from the litter? There's only one way, and that's ventilation. It's the only tool available for us to be able to remove that moisture from your house. So as I mentioned, it's going to be the main driving force in that second week until the end of the cycle. But it doesn't mean it's not a concern within that first week. So in fact, you can get moisture buildup in that litter even before the chicks are placed in the house. So you want to make sure that the shavings that you place in those houses are kept dry. You're not putting in some moisture or wet shavings or high moisture contact shavings. Keep them dry before putting them in the house. Any leaking nipples, any leaking drinker lines, any moist areas in the houses, you need to be able to remove that and replace that with nice, fresh, dry litter. Low or no ventilation prior to placement means that moisture can still build up in your house and settle into that litter. So we recommend starting your minimum ventilation even before the chicks arrive, so that they can be placed in a nice, fresh, oxygen-enriched environment, and you can remove any moisture that might still be left in the houses, potentially from cleaning the houses, and if you've got a short turnaround, you haven't dried the houses enough, that you just try and get as much of that moisture out before the chicks are placed. Okay, and the birds are drinking more today. So this is even sort of some old data from the University of Georgia, where you can see a difference between the year 2000 and 2010, that there was a 20% increase in the amount of water consumption that the birds are taking. And when you look at that total amount of water that they're taking in, 75% of what they're taking in is going to be released back into your housing environment. That's the moisture that you need to be able to remove on a daily basis to keep your litter dry. So they're only going to be utilizing 25% or so for all the metabolic functions and everything else, and 75% is almost going to be added back into your houses, and you need to have the correct minimum ventilation to be able to remove that. We just take an example at the bottom here, a house of 42,000 birds at 2 kgs. So at the end of the cycle, they can produce around 8,400 liters of water in a day. So you need to remove that. We spoke about this yesterday in brooding, but making sure that you've got the correct flow rates on your drinker lines. You need to make sure that you check the litter underneath the drinker lines. You don't want any moisture, additional moisture coming from your drinker lines. The birds are already adding a lot. Make sure that there's no leaky nipples, that you don't have high pressures or too high pressures that the nipples are leaking and they're getting into the litter, and you're making big, wet, moist patches in your houses, leading to wet litter and pododermatitis. So higher pressure does not mean higher consumption. So don't think that, yeah, you want to get more pressure so that birds drink more and eat more and grow more. That's not going to be the case. If the pressure is too low, you can reduce intakes. So you want to make sure that you get the right pressures, and check the litter underneath your drinker lines to be able to tell if you're on the right track or not. Again, mention this, making sure your drinker heights are at the correct height. So you want your birds to be able to stretch upwards with their necks and drink upwards. You don't want them to be don't want to make it sure it's too high that they have to lift off their feet. But if it's too low, they're going to be drinking to the side. And what's going to happen is extra bits of water are going to drop down their necks and onto the litter, into the drinking cups or the drip cups if you have. Those can overflow, and you're going to lead to higher moisture in your houses. So this is just a picture. It's very difficult to capture this, but basically these drinker lines were a little bit low for this bird. And you can see it's drinking to the side, and you can see there's bits of water that are splashing out onto the litter, and you can already see in this picture how wet this house's litter is. So this is going to be a video, and hopefully you can see it. It might be difficult, but these drinker lines are going to be too low, and the bird's drinking to the sides, and you can see there's water in these cups, and there's birds drinking out of there, but there's a lot of moisture or water that's dripping from their chins onto the litter, and you can see how wet this litter is as well. So those drinker cups can hold some bacteria, so we don't want them to be drinking out of those cups. So you're going to think about your litter as a sponge. So it's a sponge with a limited water holding capacity. So the birds are constantly adding moisture, as I mentioned, and you might sort of think, you know, day 18 or day 21, you see all of a sudden your litter is wet, and you go, but you know, a few days ago, it seemed to be fine, and it just turned all of a sudden. And that's because your litter is like a sponge. So it slowly builds up, slowly builds up, slowly builds up, and then all of a sudden it overflows, and it's all sort of wet, and it's not going to be good for the birds. So if you see that at day 21, that you've got wet litter, it's how your minimum ventilation or how you were ventilating was not enough a week or 2 weeks prior to that, because the moisture slowly built up over time. And this is just a good example to show of poor sort of humidity control in the houses, that's going to lead to a wet litter scenario. So over a few days, over 10 days, you can see that the humidity in the house was at placement or at the start was 45%, and it slowly rose over the sort of 10-day period, and that's going to lead to wet litter all of a sudden over here. So you need to control your humidity in your houses and maintain it within the correct levels. Okay, so you're going to get moisture from your drinker systems. There's going to be moisture from the birds, potentially moisture coming in from your outside environment, and your minimum ventilation needs to be able to remove all of this added moisture. So we need to remove the correct amount of air, and we need to move that air in the correct manner. So we're going to look into those two now. If you see wet litter in your houses, it means your minimum ventilation was not enough, so you weren't pulling enough air, or you weren't moving that air or conditioning that air in the correct way. So we'll go through those two now. So firstly, air exchange. Air exchange is basically the ability of your ventilation system to remove all the air from the house and replace it with fresh air. So one air exchange is removing that volume of air and replacing it with fresh air. And we want to have a minimum total number in the beginning of air exchanges of around 36. So every 40 minutes or so, you want to replace that stale air in the house with fresh air. And we sort of recommend a fan capacity that's able to remove that air in the house within 8 minutes. However, we're going to run that on a cycle timer. And we recommend, again, a 5-minute cycle, and that's going to perform an air exchange every 40 minutes. So here's just our sort of recommended guideline or table on minimum ventilation timers. So you can see here on time at day 1, 60 seconds, that's what we recommend as a minimum, 240 off. That's a total cycle length of 300 seconds. And that's going to get you your 5-minute cycle time, as I mentioned. And then you slowly increase that, pointer, slowly increase that as the birds get older. And what you put on for the on time, you take off from the off time. So your cycle length remains the same. And if it's not enough, if you're still seeing wet litter issues, if you're still getting high carbon dioxide, there's only one way to correct it, and that's increasing the air volume. So you reduce that off time by a set amount, and then you increase the on time by the same amount. And you want to do that in small adjustments. So just by increasing it by 10 seconds, that can increase the cycle length and the total air exchanges, say from, in this first example at day 1, from 36 to 40. So you get 4 extra air exchanges just by increasing your cycle length by 10 seconds. So do those small adjustments to help keep your litter dry and your carbon dioxide levels low. So these minimum ventilation charts, they just provide a good general starting point. Okay, they don't take into account a lot of factors. They don't take into account your house temperature, your relative humidity on each day, the outside temperature and relative humidity, how you are managing your drinker systems, how efficient your fans are at the different pressures you're running in your houses. So they don't take those into consideration. They're good starting points, as I mentioned, but you need to make fine adjustments based on what you are seeing and measuring in your houses. So you want to target a humidity in your house of between 50 and 60 would be ideal. If you're consistently having over 70% relative humidity, then that's going to eventually get wet litter in your house. And you don't want it to be too dry either, so you don't want it to be constantly less than 30%, because then you're going to get some very dusty dry litter, and that can also be detrimental to the birds. So you closely monitor your litter moisture. As I mentioned, underneath the drinker lines, you want to sort of be 20 to 25%. Obviously, it's going to be difficult for you to measure that exact amount, but what you can do is you can grab a bunch of litter from underneath the drinker line, squeeze it in your hand. If it sticks into a ball, then your litter is probably a bit too wet. If it just breaks apart into sort of fine dust, then your litter is probably a bit too dry. But you want to just make sure that it just breaks apart lightly. But yeah. And adjust your drinker lines accordingly, get the right flow rates and heights, and make sure there's no leaking in your drinker lines. You may have to run different programs in daytime versus nighttime. And when you've got nice, warm, sunny days, don't be afraid to increase your ventilation rate. That can, if you're worried about moisture removal, you've got a nice sunny day and it's a little bit warmer outside, increase your ventilation, minimum ventilation, and remove that extra bit of moisture to compensate if there's a cold, wet night, or for a period where you've had a lot of cold, wet rain during the day. Okay, so that's talking about the amount of air exchange, or the amount that we need to ventilate. And now we're going to move on to how to correctly ventilate or move that air in your house. So there's a phenomenon we call stratification. And basically, I'm sure all of you are aware that hot air rises. So that's all your hottest part in the house, or the hottest pocket of air in the house, is going to be at the ceiling. So we can see in this picture, it's a nice thermal image, and it's in black here at the bottom, which might be difficult for you to see, but it says it's sort of 30.1 degrees Celsius on the floor over here. And as we go up this piece of paper that we put in the house, you can see on the roof, 37.4 degrees Celsius. So around about 2 to 6 degrees Celsius per meter in stratification. So we want to take advantage of this with our minimum ventilation systems. And what I mean by that is, if we have some very cold air outside, 4 degrees Celsius, and we have 100% humidity, so it's very wet, cold air, we want to be able to condition that air correctly. And the way we do that is by heating it up. And we've got that hot pocket of air at the top of the house, so we want to make sure that we can keep our air near the top of the roof or the ceiling and get it to reach that peak of the house to be able to condition properly. So you can see as it comes in, the relative humidity of that air decreases, its temperature increases. So 4 degrees outside, 10 degrees once it gets inside over here. Once it reaches that peak, 27 degrees Celsius, and its relative humidity is 25%. So that's what we want to do to make sure that we can condition that air correctly and it can dry your floors. If you've got incorrect air movement, if you're not conditioning your air properly, if you're not running the right pressures, or having the low capacities, etc., then potentially that air is not going to reach that hot pocket. It's going to fall short. It's going to have lower temperatures. It's going to have higher relative humidity, and it's not going to be able to pick up moisture from your litter. And you're potentially going to get poor litter, cold birds because you're dumping cold air on them. It's going to lead to more stress, more mortality, higher energy costs in your houses, and that's going to eventually be higher feed conversions as well for those chicks. So this is just a nice thermal image from a poultry house where you can see quite clearly, this is the inlet over here, and you can see 10.4 degrees. And as the air comes in, you can see how it's heating up. That just shows a nice practical picture of the one I showed you before. Okay, so why do we want to get the relative humidity down of that incoming air? So basically, this is it's pure physics, and what we know is if we take, say, a fixed volume of air, say 100 cubic meters of air at 5 degrees Celsius, we know that that air can only hold a maximum of 600 milliliters of water or moisture. If we increase the temperature of that air by 10 degrees Celsius, so it's now 15, it's the same volume of air. We haven't changed the amount of air that we've brought in. It's still 100 cubic meters. But now its relative humidity is a lot lower, and it can hold double the amount of moisture, 1,200 milliliters. So this was 100% relative humidity. We made it 50% relative humidity, and it can hold 1,200 milliliters. If we heat that up again by 10 degrees Celsius, its relative humidity drops, and it can hold double what it did before, 2,400 mils. Heat it up even more, 10 degrees, and it drops again, and it can hold much more, the same amount of air. So when you bring in air to your house, if you can heat it up, if you can lower its relative humidity, it can hold more moisture. It can pick up more moisture from the litter, and it can remove that from your houses, keeping your litter dry. and making sure the birds have good quality conditions. So how do we do this correctly? Well, we run our houses using negative pressure. And negative pressure is determined by, or the pressure of your house is determined by the amount of inlet opening available to the fans that you are using. So if you have your inlets open less, then you're going to get more pressure. If you have the inlets open more with the same amount of fans, then you're going to get less pressure. Okay. And we want to make sure that we don't want to, if we want to try and target, we've got our recommended sort of air speeds and pressures that you should run depending on the width of your house to be able to condition your air correctly. So if we say you've got a 15-meter wide house, you want to target 31 pascals. Some people might, just crack their inlets only very, very a small amount. And what happens then is that, yes, you get 31 Pascal and you think, fantastic, I've got exactly what the recommendation is. That's perfect. However, you're not going to get the volume of air. You're not bringing in enough air into your houses to make sure that it's fresh and make sure that you remove that moisture. So you need to have a minimum opening on your inlets of around about 2.5 to 5 centimeters, or sort of 2 fingers width, as you can see from this picture. Again, you need to make sure that your house is tight, that the only air being brought into your house from your fans is, or from the negative pressure in your house, is through your inlets. So it's important to achieve the correct pressures. The best practice is to make sure that you can check your houses for any leaks and cracks. You can walk around your house with a smoke machine, put some fans on, close everything up, and you can see if there's any smoke being pulled in through any leaks or cracks and make sure that they are sealed. So you want to seal all of those, and you want to make sure that your inlets are working properly at all times. If you've got these any sort of type of inlets, then make sure that the drawstrings are correct for stretching, for any looseness. Make sure the cables have been stretched a bit, and make sure the springs, tensions, etc. are all correct. So your inlet should also shut and seal well. As you can see in this picture, there's a bit of a, these inlets should be shut, but you can see there's some leakage over here, and that's going to leak some cold air, and it's going to dump onto the chicks sitting over here, and you can get some wet litter on the sides of your houses and some cold chicks, so we don't want that. And you can test how sort of how tight your house is. So we have a way to test that using the pressure test. So basically what you do is you just need to close all your inlets, close all your doors, and you turn on the equivalent of 18 meters cubed per hour of fan capacity for every meter cubed of floor area in your house. And then you measure the pressure drop across any inlet or any door. And what you want, if you've got an old house, which I think a lot of the RCL Foods houses will be old houses rather than new builds. And if you're looking at what you want, if your pressure is more than 37.5 Pascal, then you know you've got a well-sealed house. That most of the air, or almost all the air, is going to be coming through the inlets only. Whereas if you've got less than 25 Pascal, then you know you've got a lot of leakage in that house, that there's air being pulled in from all sorts of cracks and leaks that need to be sealed. So new houses, if you've got a new build, then you want to see that pressure being almost 50 Pascal or more. But just a quick example, most of your houses are in these sort of dimensions, 120 meters long, 15 meters wide. So you calculate that area, 1,800 meters squared. Turn on the fan capacity, as I mentioned, 18 meters cubed per hour for every meter squared of floor area. So that means we need to put on a fan capacity with 32,400 meters cubed per hour. And that's roughly probably one of your big tunnel fans. And then you can use it again and again in the future to just see how the pressure changes over time, and if repairs are needed, or if you need to seal up any more leaks or cracks that have come about over time. Just quickly for some of the breeder guys, looking at light traps over the inlets. So light traps block light entry through the inlet and through the exhaust fans. which is great, which is exactly what you need. However, there is a bit of a dilemma. So when you restrict light coming into the house, you also potentially restrict airflow. So you might need to have, you're probably going to have to operate your houses with higher house operating pressures, and smoke test those houses to make sure that whatever pressure you need to achieve, you're getting that correct airflow, that air conditioning with that air coming into the inlets, and then conditioning or reaching the peak of the house and getting warm and having lower relative humidity. So the key is you want to get a good light trap that it blocks out light, but without overly restricting airflow. Okay, so you don't want your fans to have to work too hard. Okay, so this is just an example here. Hopefully you can all see this video well. So the pressure in this house is low, and what we see, not the correct pressure, smoke's coming into the house. This is just representative of the air movement. And you can see it's not getting to the peak over here. It's just falling straight onto these birds, onto the litter over here. If it's 4 degrees outside and it's raining, 100% humidity, that cold, high humid air is going to cause wet litter, it's going to cause chilling, and that's not going to be good. Okay, so we need to make sure your inlets are open correct. If they're open too small, as I mentioned, less than 2.5 or less than 3 centimeters, then that's also you're gonna have the correct pressures, but you might not have you're probably not gonna have the correct air conditioning. So this is a video that will show that. So this inlet is just cracked open slightly. Just cracked. The farmer's happy because he's got the right pressure that Cobb told him to get, but actually what's happening is that air is just not conditioning at all. It's just dropping straight down onto the birds, causing wet litter, and that's not going to be good. Okay, so you want a nice, good size opening of inlet to get the air volume behind it, to be able to move further into the house and get to the peak of the house and condition correctly. What we talk about is a sort of attached air jet. You want it to attach to the ceiling of your house as soon as possible so that it only gets sort of resistance coming from below. If you've got air coming in the middle of the house, you don't want it to be getting resistance from the top and from the bottom, because then it's not you're gonna need higher pressures and more wind speed to be able to get it to the peak of the house. So you want it to attach to the ceiling. It's gonna sit nicely on your ceiling and then be able to reach the peak of the house. So here we see the correct example. This is what we want to achieve. Air comes into the house, it hasn't reached the ground yet, it gets to the peak of the house, hasn't reached the birds yet, conditioned well, and now it gets slowly getting down to bird level. It's now heated up, it's got lower relative humidity, it's picking up all that moisture from the litter, and then it eventually gets removed through the exhaust fans. That's what we want to achieve. If you have any obstructions in your house, such as I-beams or anything else, that's going to restrict the airflow getting to the peak of your house. So some things you can do for that is difficult to see in this picture, but you need to put a sort of deflector in there to help get that air over that I-beam or any obstruction so that it can reach the peak of the house rather than bouncing back down. So here you can see it a bit nicer. In this example, here they've got this big metal I-beam, and you want the air, if this deflector wasn't here, that air would have just gone up. It's going to cause disruption of the airflow against this beam. So what they did was put this nice piece of plywood or some wood material over here, and that makes a nice sort of deflector for that air to move smoothly past that and then get to the peak of the house. Again, smoke in your house is the best tool that you can use to be able to make sure that you're getting correct airflow. All right, lastly, we're going to talk about some circulation fans. I know there have been a number of trials, or a lot of houses around RCL Foods areas have been putting in some of these circulation fans. They work very well. They really reduce the temperature difference, that stratification that I was talking about between the peak of the ceiling and down onto the litter. And they reduce that temperature difference by moving that warm air back down towards bird level. So it increases your floor temperatures during brooding, keeps your litter drier, reduces your heating costs, and basically you want the fans installed as close as possible to that ceiling, to that hottest part of the house, and make sure that they're tilted slightly upwards to prevent any drafts during brooding. So you wanted the sort of where the air is blowing towards to be tilted slightly upwards, so that if it was tilted a little bit downwards, then there's potentially going to cause some drafts over those chicks, and we don't want to have that. Okay, so how should these be installed, or what capacity should you use? So basically, you want to have the circulation fan capacity of mixing approximately 10 to 20% of your house volume every minute. So an example, if we've got a 120 meter wide house and it's 15 meters wide and its average height is 3.2 meters, then we're looking at a house volume of 5,760 meters cubed. Let's say we want to put in 20% stirring fan capacity, multiply it by 20%. So that's the amount of stirring fan capacity we should install in our houses. And then you have a look at your circulation fan capacity specs. So let's say we've got a 600 millimeter fan. It's got a capacity of 6,000 meters cubed per hour, or make it to the same units. This is in meters cubed per minute. So this capacity of this fan is 100 meters cubed per minute. We just divide the two, and that tells us we need 11 or 12 fans to be able to reach that 20% circulation fan capacity in this house. And that'll be a good amount to make sure that you get good circulation, you get good air movement, you get good conditioning, and good removal of moisture from the litter. Sort of layouts that you install them in your houses. So I think there's not too many houses in the RCL Foods group that are 20 meters. I think there might be a few though, but generally around sort of 12 to 15 meter wide houses, you're going to have one line in the middle of your house, and basically you have the fans in the ceiling, one pointing to one side of the house, the gable end, and the other one in the center going the other side, and then you space the fans around about 17.5 or 18 meters apart, blowing in that direction. And what you get is you get good fast air movement in the peak of that house at the top, and then you get a slow return. It comes down to bird level, and you get a slow return of air movement across the floor, picking up all that moisture because it's moved all this warm, dry air from the ceiling back down to floor level, and that can pick up the moisture, nice dry litter, better heating in your houses, and sort of lower heating required because it's getting that warm air back down to the sensor levels. So the house says, yep, temperatures are good in the house. Whereas if the hot air just rises all the time, and you're not bringing it back down to bird level, then your sensors might say, well, it's cold, push more air, we need more heating, more gas, or more coal, and that could increase the heating costs. So it helps with that, helps with litter removal, helps with air conditioning. So it can be a very good tool to make sure you keep your litter dry and a good environment during the winter time. If you've got a wider house, as we mentioned, 20 meters or more, then you're going to put 2 lines of these fans pretty much in the same way as what we did in this house, except they're going to be 12 meters apart in the middle, and then spaced every 20 meters, you put another fan. So just a summary now, minimum ventilation, that's responsible for air quality in your house. You need to provide enough oxygen to those birds at all times. Make sure you keep your carbon dioxide levels below 3,000 parts per million. moisture control. That becomes your main driving factor for minimum ventilation after that first week. And you want to use a good cycle time. As we said, we recommend 5 minutes, and make sort of slight increases to that ventilation rate over time. It's important to ventilate enough air, so you want the correct air volume or air exchange in your house, but you also need to move the air in the correct manner. You need to condition it correctly. So condition it correctly, it's going to help reduce those heating costs, going to help keep the litter dry, going to help get make a good environment for your birds to thrive and get good performance. And circulation fans, they can help significantly if you struggle during the winter times with keeping your litter dry. And that's it. Thank you very much.